everyone, and welcome to Beginnings, the show that asks, where do creative people come from? My name is Andy. I am the host of the show and a writer and performer based in Los Angeles, California, where it's a nice 70 degrees, a warm day in the dawning dystopia. I'm here with my cat Squee and my dog Mabel sitting on the ground. Am I painting you a picture? This is a good episode today. This is Nels Cline. If you don't know who Nels is, let me read you his bio right now. Musician Nels Cline is best known these days as the lead guitarist in the band Wilco, but his recording and performing career, spanning jazz, rock, punk, and experimental, is well into its fourth decade, with over 200 recordings, including at least 30 for which he is leader. Nels has received many accolades, including Rolling Stone anointing him as both one of 20 new guitar gods and one of the top 100 guitarists of all time. Beyond Wilco, Nels performs in a duo project with guitarist Julian Lodge. Hope I'm pronouncing his name right. In addition to a quartet, the Nels Cline 4, collaborates with his partner Yuka Honda as the duo Cup, leads the Nels Cline Singers, and that is just a brief survey of his many projects. His most recent albums are Wilco's 2019 record, Ode to Joy, and the Nels Cline Singers 2020 album, Share the Wealth. This was very exciting. I've been listening to Nels' music since college. I was very excited when he joined Wilco, and he's a very thoughtful dude. We go into his whole history and how we ended up playing guitar for a living, as I am wont to do on this show. But it was quite a lovely hour with Nels. I hope you enjoy it. Before we get into the show, though, always in the beginning, I like to do a little recommended if you like for new listeners. If this is your first time listening to Beginnings and you like this, well, maybe you'll like my talks with other musicians. For example, I've talked to people like Mitski and Dean Wareham, Sam Prekop, Owen Pallett, Bobby Previtt, Thurston Moore, tons of other people, tons of other writers, tons of other musicians, tons of other artists, tons of other comedians, and so on and so forth. If you want to subscribe to the show, you can do that wherever you get your podcast from. If you want to follow me on social media, I'm at Andy Beckerman on both Twitter and on Instagram. I guess I'm on TikTok, but it's just nonsense over there. I mean, it's nonsense on Twitter too. But anyway, I have some great talks coming up. Julie Doyerin, Cadence Weapon, wonderful rapper, Jim Starlin, who is a credible comic book writer and artist. If you don't know who he is, he created Thanos and basically wrote the comics that a lot of the movies are based on, a lot of the Marvel movies. And that was very cool. So stay tuned for those. But for now, let's talk to Nels. I have a lot of questions, but I kind of wanted to start with the fact that you went to college for philosophy, because that's what I was a philosophy professor before I went into comedy.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And I'm kind of curious if that was just a whim.
Oh, no. I mean, okay, well, I wanted to be a music major, but even after taking some music classes in high school, I was a late starter in terms of music theory and any guitar lessons, which I kind of still never really had more than a handful, none of which were helpful. So I was told it was too late for me to be a music major because I would have had to either be a composition major or an instrumental major. And the instrumental major I would have wanted to do would have involved playing electric guitar, not classical guitar. Mm-hmm. And at that time, I only knew of one school where I could have done that. And turns out there were maybe three. This is the mid-'70s. Berklee College of Music was the one I knew about. It turns out I probably could have gone to North Texas State, as it was called, or University of Miami. But I didn't know that. And I also had no interest in going to any place other than Los Angeles because I was in a band with my brother and didn't want to stop playing that music. So I went for my second interest in terms of academia, I suppose, philosophy. And it was something that I was really interested in. So it wasn't a lark. It was, but it was not well thought out because what was I going to do with philosophy except teach philosophy? I don't know, or maybe write some book that no one would read, you know? So I only did it for a year. And I went to Occidental College, and it was actually a marvelous experience. My teacher, who was also the head of the philosophy department, William Neblett, had been a jazz bass player and was just a really interesting man. And I had a lot of really great classes in various subjects at Occidental. So it was overall a really good experience, but an extremely expensive school. And so I really realized after 3 semesters that this was not right, that my parents were coughing up all this bread for me to do something that was not my number one passion, nor did I feel it was my destiny or whatever, you know. So I ceased my philosophy studies, which had veered into, I should say, maybe sort of focused on Eastern philosophy after a while, and went to a community college and started theory over again with a much better teacher, and I excelled. And I won't go into detail unless you want to hear it about what my high school music education was like, but it was, I would say, woefully inadequate, and had me scratching my head and thinking that I would never understand and be able to learn music in a technical sense. But once I went to this community college, sort of a last second decision, it turned out to be a really great decision. And I was able to comprehend what was happening because I had a fantastic theory teacher.
I mean, I want to ask more about college, but for a second, like when you were playing music, right? I think I remember reading something where you kind of just taught yourself, right? In high school. And I'm just trying to get into your brain a little bit. And like when you're playing, are you like, was that an actual worry that you wanted the technical knowledge, like the theoretical knowledge? Or because, okay, here's the whole background of this thing. When I hear your guitar playing, I can know your guitar playing. Like if I hear someone else that's playing like you, I'm like, oh, that's Nels Cline. Like they're doing a version of you. And to me, that means that your style is something singular and kind of organically comes out of you. And I'm wondering if that was something that emerged out of you kind of naturally. And if so, then did you really want the theoretical knowledge? Was it more to professionalize? Like what was the impetus to want that theoretical knowledge? Does that make any sense?
Oh, it does. It's going to lead us in a few directions here, I think, if I'm able to adequately sort of cover the different angles that this suggests. Well, for one thing, I just want to say, I don't, to this day, think that I have that recognizable of a style, but I feel chameleon-like. So I'm always surprised by this. And I do know that there are certain things that people could identify as my sound that developed over time. But I can also say that very few of them, if any, were particularly conscious. I think it developed naturally, if that's even possible. But to try to speak to your question about technique and theory and whatnot, I wanted to learn that stuff because I had been really interested in what I could only sort of, I guess, generally at this point describe as blues rock, you know. And before that, psychedelic rock and folk rock and but rock, you know. And then I heard John Coltrane. I heard the song Africa. Mm-hmm. My brother Alex, and we did everything together in those days. We were listening to everything together, playing together all the time, since we were 12 years old. And we went from our obsession with what we could generally call rock and roll to a vast sea of unknowing and but inspiration that we started to get from what we could generally call jazz. So around the same time, my last blues rock hero, really, Duane Allman, was killed on his motorcycle. And it was around then that I started to turn my back on blues rock because I couldn't listen to it happily like I used to. And at the same time, casting about for, I guess, just new input, our high school friend named Lee Kaplan, along with my brother's general interest in bands like Pink Floyd and King Crimson, sort of turned my head towards what I could guess we call progressive rock, prog. And the combination of a nascent awareness of jazz and jazz-related music, in my case, like modal jazz of John Coltrane, and also Alex and I became really interested in what was being termed electric jazz, and now we might term fusion, as it was being presented by Miles Davis, Bitches Brew, for example, and the Tony Williams Lifetime, and the Mahavishnu Orchestra, and groups like this, Herbie Hancock's Mwandishi group, Weather Report. These were very important groups to us in early high school, along with King Crimson and Yes and Focus. And I guess Pink Floyd was starting to go into the background at that point. But anyway.
Do you mind if I interrupt for just a second?
Sure.
Do you remember what it was that grabbed your brain? Like, is it even something you can put into words? But like, what was like John Coltrane, or what was it of these bands that kind of like piqued your interest? Was it just the turning away from blues rock? Was it just the sadness and you're like, I got to find something new? Again, I'm trying to like put it all into like conscious words, but.
Well, I think it was a wide open curiosity and a very intuitive reaction, and the first music that I became really interested in on a serious level was Indian classical music, which I heard in my fifth grade class while we were studying India, and the teacher named Miss Godlin played Ravi Shankar live for a whole entire side of a World Pacific recording, and
the whole side.
Yeah.
Was she like nursing a hangover that day?
Oh no, it was great. It would change my life. And the class was moaning and groaning. A lot of the kids were like, hated it. And I became obsessed with sitar, and particularly, I guess, Ravi Shankar, and with all kinds of things relating to Indian classical music in a very obviously, West Los Angeles kind of touristic way, I guess. But it was my first awareness of music as an endeavor beyond entertainment. It was seemed like something very serious and a higher calling, if you will. So hearing Africa figured very heavily into that feeling of it's a drone, it wasn't bebop. It had a kind of somberness and a severity about it, yet it was very inviting. And of course, Eric Dolphy's arrangement is miraculous and colorful. And so it was a natural thing. And the thing about progressive rock was musical interest, because Alex and I were always interested in instrumental music, probably a little more than vocal music. And we're always interested in the extended instrumental forays. Whether that was just jamming, which in the case of, say, Johnny Winter or the Allman Brothers Band, still really, really treasured that. And then with long form composition and maybe a slight degree of improvisation that one hears in some of these first generation so-called progressive rock bands, there was musical interest, and that's what we were interested in. So we found this vista, if you will, of musical possibilities that were being presented by these very hip-looking, effete dudes, mostly from overseas. So there's exotica there, and then I felt like I needed to really learn how to play guitar, because I was playing with, I played mostly with two fingers. I only knew a handful of chords that my father had actually showed me when he went to folk guitar night class. And I was no longer, I guess, feeling that was enough. I was a very primitive, not particularly adroit player. And hearing Robert Fripp and Steve Howe and Jan Ackerman and these kinds of individuals fired my imagination. It should be noted around the same time that I was starting to listen to jazz guitar, which was, I think, aesthetically less appealing to me in terms of tone and whatnot. But of course, in terms of melodic and harmonic ideas, it was very stimulating and, of course, baffling to someone like me who knew very little about such things. So baffling is always a good thing if you're curious. So
yeah,
I started listening voraciously to all kinds of musical expression. Certainly it was interesting to listen to jazz music that I loved, realizing that there was no guitar on most of it, So the role of the guitar, that as I looked into my uncertain future, was perhaps in question, maybe vague at best. But the music I was hearing was so stimulating and really inspiring that I just started moving forward out of rock and blues rock. And this was a time when glam rock was really big.
Mm-hmm.
And I wasn't really very interested in those kinds of sounds and song forms. It just wasn't interesting enough for me anymore. So I kind of got away from straightforward 3.5 minute, 4-minute rock and roll for a few years there.
Are you and your brother, are you fraternal or identical twins?
Identical.
Okay. So this might be a weird question, but when you were younger, when ideas formed between you two, was there a dominant personality? Did an idea form with one of you? This is the picture I have in my mind, that it forms with one of you and then you bounce it back and forth. But I've just made this up in my head based on absolutely no evidence.
Well, I'm not sure how to answer that with any accuracy. There's no doubt that we were different, had different tastes, but we listened to everything together. And I think without too much discussion, formed, I guess, unified ideas about how to move together into some kind of music that spoke to my interest in what had been blues guitar and was now becoming this kind of more melodic, sort of tasteful and harmonically slightly more interesting guitar work. And my brother's interest in far more avant-garde music at the time. And he had interests in possibly presenting theatricality as an element, which we never addressed, because I was trying to be, in spite of the fact that Jimi Hendrix was my real inspiration to finally play guitar for life, I was never desiring to have any flamboyant musical personality. I wanted to be tasteful and rather retiring, I suppose, as a presence,
How come?
So,
How come?
Oh, I don't know. It's like this whole idea of whatever modesty is, or I still tire of being seen when I play, and I wish I could be invisible. But I was just very sort of buttoned down, and my brother was pretty flamboyant, in his ideas, and he used to be a very colorful dresser, and he loved Frank Zappa and the Mothers of Invention and Captain Beefheart, along with Black Sabbath and Grand Funk and bands like that. Jethro Tull was important. And the theatrical rock was starting to sort of find its legs or whatever with progressive rock. And then later, obviously, with bands like Kiss or Slade or Blue Oyster Cult. But my brother's interest in theatricality had a lot to do with his interest in surrealism and Dada. So he had, I remember, and he may not even remember this, had this idea that we could play somewhere or he could have this perfect power trio because he really liked power trio music. And I was kind of more into something a little more low key. And he wanted to figure out how to put M80 dynamite into buckets of white paint, for example, and explode white paint all over everybody and all over the band. And he had also an interest in playing woodwinds. He had played clarinet reluctantly in elementary school when I reluctantly played trumpet. And but when he heard Eric Dolphy, he developed an interest in bass clarinet. And in those days, there were music programs in school, so he could borrow a bass clarinet from the school and take it home and just squeak and wail on it without knowing what he was doing. And so we used to have a piece of music where I would play drums in 5/8 and he would just go crazy on bass clarinet. And so we just sort of, I guess, indulge each other's proclivities for tastefulness on one side and extremes on the other, and eventually came up with a group in high school that aesthetically isn't really all that different from what I'm doing now. It's just I play better now.
So, okay, I'm trying to imagine this. Do you push more towards being modest, more towards wanting to like kind of fade into the background? He pushes more towards avant-garde, Dada, performance, right? Are you guys pushing against each other at all, or are you just kind of naturally going in like however you kind of felt?
It was totally natural. Yeah, there was we just literally did everything together all the time, and rarely argued about anything. I think that my brother, who could become angered in those days, he's pretty hard to anger now, was only bugged by people who didn't practice or didn't show up for practice, or, you know what I mean? We just wanted to be playing all the time. So we were looking for people who had at least enough discipline to practice and want to get together and play music. And that was pretty hard, actually, in high school. In junior high school, we had a band that was pretty good, and we played some cover material and a lot of instrumental stuff, but that was before I ever heard progressive rock or anything like that,
Yeah.
And there was a really good guitar player in that band along with me, and that's kind of how I learned to play a semi-normal rock guitar, was from standing next to this man, Bill Watts, while he was a boy then, Bill Watts, and who could play so much like Eric Clapton, in a Cream version of Eric Clapton, And so I was in awe of this guy, and I kind of just watched his hands and found some strategies to get through the experience of jamming out or covering a Beatles song or a Johnny Winter song or a Humble Pie song.
Mm-hmm. So it's less that you are trying to differentiate, you and your brother are trying to differentiate from each other, and more that you felt this kind of feeling inside and were just allowed to kind of go in that direction.
Well, okay. We were trying to differentiate each other, but that is something that wasn't necessarily musical. It stemmed from the time we were maybe 5 or 6 and realized that we didn't want to dress alike, or that we were tired of people seeing us as one half of a whole rather than as individuals. So since I don't remember any of my past lives, I don't remember what it's like to not be a twin, but one gets singled out growing up as an identical twin for sure. And we did make efforts to distinguish ourselves individually, but it's worth pointing out that the type of identical twin that we are is called a mirror twin. And so a mirror twin, as I understood it much later in life, is a type of identical twin where the egg splits at a very late stage of development. And we are basically a mirror image of each other. So he's right-handed, I'm left-handed. His hair part's on this side, mine on that side. He's, especially at this point, extremely serious, well-disciplined, somewhat socially shy and retiring. And I'm kind of sloppy and undisciplined and have become more gregarious as an adult. And have a lifestyle that's exactly the opposite of his at this point, where I'm constantly on the move and doing all kinds of things. And he has never made music his number one job or task or desire. He has his Buddhist practice and his family as his priorities, and continues to write and perform music, but never at never as a principal source of income or anything. He never wanted to play music he didn't like, so he never made playing music his job. Even though he did it, he still does. He has a bunch of records out of his own that are beautiful.
What was the difference for you? Where you were like, one of the things in a creative industry that I've learned, especially in TV, is that you take gigs because you have to pay the rent and you have to buy food and you have to buy cat litter. What was the difference between you two where you were like, yeah, I can live with that as long as I get to do the things I want to do?
I didn't do a lot of gigs when I was younger and playing because, number one, I felt ill-equipped to even play in a wedding band. I didn't know didn't know a lot of songs, didn't have that kind of mindset. Coming out of what we were inspired by in the late 60s and early 70s, we wanted to play our own music. So we wrote all our own music, even in high school. We did cover some songs one lunchtime playing at our high school. We played a John McLaughlin song from Devotion. I think it was Dragon Song. And we played What I Say from Live Evil by Miles Davis. But I think that was as far as we went into cover music in high school. So I think it's worth noting that I didn't take gigs to make money kind of ever. I worked day jobs instead. And so in that way, Alex and I had similar ideas about music making, which was that we only wanted to make our own music. My life just took a different direction when in the mid 90s, I ended up playing with Mike Watt. And then pretty soon I'm out playing, punk rock songs and playing in rock venues and traveling around the country in his van, which later led to me playing with the Geraldine Fibbers. And there I was playing rock and roll again. And before that, I'd been in a band in Los Angeles that never toured, but that was together for 8 years playing this kind of very hocketed, funk-inspired kind of rock and roll. This band called Block, and I played in clubs there. And that was a desire I had to. Stuart Liebig, the bass player, and this band named Chris Mancinelli, who's the drummer, started that band. And I was down to do it because I was wanting to play in places where people weren't all sitting down. And I like to move around a lot when I'm playing. So that was sort of, I guess, the beginning of me going back into rock. And then playing with Mike Watt changed everything. I didn't really have to be at the day job every day. I was allowed to go on tour and come back to work. And I just worked in book and record stores and a record distributor. I didn't have any hard jobs. I didn't have to work in an office. I didn't have to drive a cab. I just had cool jobs that didn't pay and that had minimal responsibility. So I could go out and do little tours with Vinnie Golia or go out and do whatever, because none of that was making any money. There was no money in music until, I guess, I joined Wilco.
I mean, how did your parents react to this decision? Like early on in your life, like say high school or even into college, how did were they supportive?
They were. We were very lucky from the very beginning. It was evident that our parents, who were both teachers in the Los Angeles City school system, they taught junior high school, each for about 33 years. And they liked the idea of art and artists, lucky for us. So as opposed to many people that I know of various generations, we didn't have to rebel to play rock and roll. All we had to do was agree to keep our grades up. And they didn't buy us instruments until they knew we were really serious. And that was a gradual step up for me, of like $30 guitar my dad bought from a student that I had when I was 12, which I still have, to guitar bought at May Company department store, to guitar that was a copy of a Les Paul Custom, to a Gibson guitar, which I still have. And they came to our shows sometimes. They were often perplexed by our music and our decisions that we had made in our music, but they were always really supportive. And my dad was sort of a king of sarcasm. And so he could, if he felt like it, kind of chide us about certain things that we were doing. But I've always felt that they were in our corner and very proud of us as artists. My brother was going to school to be a visual artist after high school. And he was a very talented visual artist, was excelling in that area. And that made my parents really happy as well. I know they were really disappointed when neither of us got any degrees in anything, because they had come up from very poor circumstances and were among the only people in their family tree to ever get a degree and go to college even. So I think that was the hardest thing, when I just went and took music classes, didn't finish philosophy, and then started working in the record store and playing. And I think back on what I did in the 80s, for example, I was all over the place because I would work all day at the record store, and then I had rehearsals mostly in various projects and sometimes gigs all the time. And I recently thought back on what my schedule was like when I found this piece of paper, like I was doing this and that. And I was married then, first wife, and just running around all the time, all around Los Angeles. But I didn't think about it because I was doing what I liked, when I was out doing those things. But I wasn't making a living playing music, not even close.
Are your parents from Los Angeles?
Well, they're not alive anymore, but my father was. He was born, as were Alex and I, downtown Los Angeles. His family moved to San Pedro when he was a boy. Prior to that, they were living in Bunker Hill tenement housing. My mother was from South Dakota, a farm, middle of nowhere, no electricity. Her father was a Danish immigrant after whom I am named. And in the Dust Bowl was when my uncle Winston, who was the superintendent of Pomona City Schools, by the way, and my mother moved their parents from South Dakota farm out to California. And my mother hated the farm. And she excelled in her studies. So she went to college, I think, started when she was 16 and matriculated to UCLA. And that was it, California, after the Depression and the Dust Bowl.
Yeah. Yeah. I have to imagine this was a paradise compared with that. And I mean, also the other thing that I'm thinking of is like, well, how do they become such open people then? Like, what I want to imagine, like, I think of my grandmother who went through the Depression and very anxious. And I mean, also we're Jewish. So, and my grandfather fought in World War II. So I can imagine all of that stuff creating the anxiety that leaked into me. But they seem from the way you describe pretty open, pretty easygoing. It seems like that leaked into you a little bit.
My dad could be easygoing. He certainly wasn't always. Dad's pretty interesting, complicated guy. They really liked music and art, and were well read. And I can't tell you I can't even begin to guess how they ended up being who they were, except to describe them to you as classic liberal Democrats, believers in social justice and social programs and a leveling of the playing field, so-called, or whatever. They used to refer to themselves as Adlai Stevenson style Democrats. I don't know how they ended up that way. I mean, especially in my father's case, it's the most perplexing because he was the oldest of three and three boys. And quite obviously the goody two-shoes of his family, having come from very poor San Pedro upbringing, a very tough town, San Pedro in those days especially. And his middle brother, my Uncle Ray, was a Navy lifer, and his youngest brother, Sidney, was a merchant marine. So I think that because my grandmother sent my dad to the movies every Saturday to get him out of the house, was what planted the seeds of desire and imagination in his head. And I think he wanted to be Cary Grant, or he wanted to be William Powell or Fred Astaire. And so that glamour and that sort of dream that is presented by pre-World War II Hollywood, I think had a huge impact on him and made him want to do something else with his life other than just be in San Pedro. And that created a certain amount of resentment in his family. I learned later because he was a goody two shoes and everybody else was pretty like roughneck. My mother's case, her father, who I never really knew either of my grandfathers. He passed away not long after coming out to California. And then I grew up around my grandmother, who moved close by in West Los Angeles where we lived, and was just a really quiet, mild person and was around us all the time until she passed away when I was maybe, I don't remember, 12 years old. And her brother, my Uncle Winston, was also like my mother, like a liberal Democrat educator. And I don't know how that happens. I don't know how you go from literally middle of nowhere, South Dakota. We visited it on a drive across the country and back one summer in 1967. I just couldn't believe it. It was absolutely terrifying to me. From that to Los Angeles and UCLA and liberal Democrat point of view. And my mother had never seen anyone but a white person till she moved to California. She'd never tasted seafood. It was like these were, new experiences coming from South Dakota.
But she was excited and open to those experiences. And I think that's what's interesting.
Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah, totally. It's still interesting to me. But I'm not sure how to explain it.
Well, I wonder if that's what kind of leaks into you. And also the fact that you grow up in a time that the world kind of like opens up a little bit, or that I talked to Terry Riley on the show, like, I don't know, like half a year ago. And he kind of described the 60s in a way that totally changed my view of it. And he basically said that, like, in the 50s, we lived in this fear that we were all going to die in a nuclear explosion. And by the 60s, that fear kind of wore off, and we realized it wasn't going to happen, or it wasn't at least imminent. And so that's why the 60s became this kind of like open period and this open party. And
I don't think I got over the fear in the late 60s. We were still doing drop drills in elementary school in 1968 and 67. I mean, drop under your desk with your head away from the windows. And the threat of nuclear holocaust was pretty much my entire childhood. Uh, and then the Cold War, which was bizarre, you know, I don't know, but that's interesting. I mean, I think that in a way that's got to be true, and also that as the pendulum swings back and forth in life itself, that the late 1960s were a reaction to the 1950s, which were so like a time of great prosperity, but also extremely conservative time. And, it's nothing like the 20s and 30s, which were pretty sexy in spite of, eventual economic depression and whatnot, and prohibition and all that. When you look at it now, as opposed to 1950s America and all those very heavy foundation garments that women had to wear, and this whole idea of 2 cars in every garage and a chicken in every pot, and the beginnings of the suburbia, expanding and becoming a thing. The 60s were obviously a reaction to that, kids who had parents that came out of that, and kids looking into that dream and saying, this is not my dream. And then, of course, drugs.
I mean, what was the culture like in West LA? You grew up in Santa Monica, right?
No, just West Los Angeles. It's not far from Santa Monica, but if now where the 10 and the 405 freeways cross, that's where we grew up. But they built the 10 freeway when we were young. In fact, I was in my storage space in Los Angeles while Wilco was in town, and found some photographs in my filing cabinet there that I'd forgotten about. And so I looked in the background to see that the 10 freeway still wasn't there. I thought it was built way sooner, like maybe when I was 6. But in these photographs, I look older than 6, and there's still no 10 freeway behind us, because it was a block away. They took all these houses, put them on wheels, wheeled them away, and put the freeway right there, a block away. So West Los Angeles was a rather nascent community in the 50s. And our house, I think, was built in the early 50s. And my parents moved into it in 1955. My brother and I were born in 1956. And we were too young to be hippies. We wanted to be hippies. And we were definitely too young to have been hanging out on the Sunset Strip when all the super ebullient and alterna youth activity was happening, and all the violence too with the police. But we were following the music assiduously by 1966. So I was really into the Byrds. My brother was really into the Rolling Stones, and we moved forward from there, basically, but we couldn't go to any shows. So we just listened to the radio, and then became obsessed with buying records. And that's all we did. We spent our allowance every 2 weeks on a record. And so we started out with top 30, top 40 radio, which is somewhat legendary now, just because the top 40 or the top 30 had everything on it. So it wasn't stylistically divided up like it is now. Certainly not like it was in the 80s, where it was harshly, rigidly divided along lines of, I'd say, not just style, but age and race, which I don't see as a good thing. So having everything all in one big list and hearing it all at the same time in the course of a day has a lot to do with why my music is kind of stylistically vague. I kind of like a little bit of everything, maybe. And I didn't think about it as being problematic until the 70s and 80s, when people looked askance at something that either lacked a so-called authenticity or purity, or that had too much variety. And the album-oriented radio, that wasn't something I paid a whole lot of attention to, except in the underground radio world. And that was perfect for people like me and my brother. We liked everything to be as long and as interesting as possible. So that freedom of freeform radio was very beneficial, if not wholly life-changing. But as far as the zeitgeist of the late 60s, I just have my own view of it. I wasn't a surfer, but I wanted to be a surfer because I liked car culture and surf music, but I can't stand surfing in the ocean or swimming in the ocean. And I have the wrong complexion to get a tan. So beach culture was always held out as this kind of ultimate thing that I couldn't really fully participate in, just like we weren't allowed to grow our hair and participate in the counterculture movement, except as rock and roll listeners and aspiring musicians. And we could put on love beads or a Nehru jacket or something. But we were also too skinny to even find pants that fit right. Or shoes. So having hip clothes wasn't even really an option.
So I'm getting a picture, open household, almost like you are like a couple years out of sync. There's a lot of yearning to be these things, but you can't be those things because you are not old enough at the time. So or not the right, or you're too skinny, or you don't have the right complexion to be a surfer. Which I feel like I say that I out here in Los Angeles, I'm like Gollum because I'm constantly going from shadow to shadow, desperate to stay out of the sun.
Well, it's a pretty good strategy. In spite of the yearning that you're, zeroing in on, I have to say it was a wondrous time to grow up. I mean, it was confusing too, because I didn't know anything about sex. I didn't know anything about what was happening in terms of the sexual revolution. But entering puberty in 1968 is it's pretty powerful when you think back on it. Just pretty wondrous. Like psychedelic music was our thing. There was a way that infused even the most banal aspects of the culture, from TV with shows like The Prisoner or Laugh-In or Get Smart or The Avengers or whatever. Some really interesting TV, and even just fonts, graphic design became super influenced by psychedelic posters, mostly associated with San Francisco rock. And we just couldn't get enough of that stuff. And then we discovered underground comics, which we were too young to be reading, but we read them anyway. And Robert Crumb became really important, not just because of all the sort of bizarre humor and transgressive ideas that one could get from that, or from S. Clay Wilson, but my brother loved that kind of draftsmanship. So he became really good at drawing his own underground cartoons. And it was just heavenly when you think back on it. It was really fun. But also, any kind of confusion or frustration was probably just normal adolescent stuff, compounded by the desire to, as you were saying, like have long hair, which was going to be something my folks would never allow, because it would demonstrate to the world that they were not in control of their kids. And my dad had to be seen as an authority, had to command respect from his contemporaries at the schools. And then the other thing that they said, which is really quite true, is that we would have looked like little girls because we were late bloomer, androgynous types. So these guys, these little blonde, towhead, it was very blonde in those days, boys with no facial hair and 28-inch waist or whatever, probably would have looked pretty femme, and gotten in trouble, because it's important to remember that hippies were getting not only beaten up but killed, by military people, police. It was a dangerous thing, in a way, a brave thing, to present oneself as a hippie in those days, because you were very obviously that kind of person, just to be visually, apprehended, but also insulted and maybe assaulted, We tend to forget this because the culture, the counterculture was so co-opted so quickly, but it still caused all kinds of strife and conflict in most towns.
Did you also have ambition? Because I'm trying to figure out if you were kind of like modest, if you were kind of like, I want to fade into the background, but I also want to play music. Besides the fact that there were some kind of, contingent things playing with Mike Watt, right? Did you have ambition? Like, I want, this is me, or did you identify with this? Like, was this your identity in some way? Like, what was the thing that like pushed you in that direction, or like pushed against that feeling of modesty? Does that make any sense?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question because I'm not sure exactly. I definitely was, I didn't think of it as ambition. I think I'm damaged by this hippie idea of like, oh, I hate money and oh, I'm not ambitious or whatever. But no, I was totally ambitious artistically. And I think there's an innocent desire, not just look at me, I'm not a nerd. It's beyond that, because I think that music as an endeavor is so important, and it's beyond any kind of sort of petty concerns about, oh, look at me and all that stuff. I wanted to blow minds, because my mind had been blown. And I'm sure that my brother would agree, maybe not to that exact terminology, but we just wanted to blow minds, including our own minds, and feel happy about something we created and see how it went with other people listening, and there wasn't, honestly, I'm not even saying we were good, because I'm not sure that we were even close, but my brother was good, but we weren't, nobody really cared about what we were doing, and we didn't really care that they didn't care, but they really didn't. We were playing music that was never going to get us, hot girls or anything like that.
Was there any, like, what was your life like? You said you were married at the time. You have a day job. You are going from practice to gig. Was there any direction, or was it just like, I'm doing this and this is, I'm having fun and it's meaningful to me?
It started out, I think, with more direction than it ended up with. But it was all pretty random. I wasn't trying to sculpt my life in any particular image of that I had, preconceived. But I was definitely following my heroes in terms of decisions I was making about when I would do my own stuff. So, for example, when I first heard Ralph Towner, which was on this Weather Report record, I Sing the Body Electric, I wanted to know more about this acoustic guitar player, Ralph Towner. And so I discovered Oregon, and I started listening to Oregon, and this really spoke to me and still does. And it's kind of cloistered, it's stylistically fast, yet, instrumentally original. Anyway, so I ended up listening to people like Keith Jarrett and Chick Corea and Bill Evans and McCoy Tyner. I met a man named Eric Von Essen, and so I played with him. He was a multi-instrumentalist, but had just picked up acoustic bass. He became my musical partner for almost 17 years. And so we did tons of music together, which ultimately led to a group called Quartet Music with my brother on a unique sort of drums and percussion setup, and Jeff Gautier on violin. And we were basically in our own way, and Eric was writing a lot of music, but we all wrote, drawing a lot from Oregon and Ralph Towner, and also from Miles Quintet with Herbie and Wayne and Ron and Tony, and I don't know, some other things. Keith Jarrett's quartet with Charlie Hayden and Dewey Redman and Paul Motion was very important. Lots of music we were listening to. So we basically did our kind of versions of that kind of music. And we would have been happy probably just doing that for a really long time, but it wasn't successful. And I started wanting to play more electric guitar again. I had a phase where I barely played electric guitar, but we had friends who had these bands, and they wanted, like our friend Wayne Pete had a band called Doppler Funk, and he wanted me to play guitar. Alex played drums, Vinny Golia played saxophone, John Fumo on trumpet, and he was playing keyboards. And it was basically like a wild fusion band with a lot of free blowing. And so now I'm learning Wayne's music, and now I'm learning Eric's music. And Eric is somebody I could ask very pointed musical questions. And so he would answer theoretical questions I had. I was learning chords from playing his fancy chords and his songs that were like, well, oh, it's like a Ralph chord or a John Abercrombie chord, whatever. And now we're listening to ECM jazz, so-called jazz, which had so much to do with music we already liked, like music from India and Brazil. And now we have Norway and Germany and then, Italy and Japan even. So this started to expand into a global awareness of music. And so there's never a moment where there was boredom or uncertainty, but I can't say there was any direction, It's in a way, I guess, kind of impulsive, but the guitar also, I think, is very adroit at a chameleonic sort of presence in the culture, because not only is it popular and people like it or think they understand it, but it's extremely malleable. And that malleability is something that I don't think I was particularly aware of or even interested in early on. It just sort of became something I was addressing because I just kept wanting to do so many different things.
Yeah. This is so reductive and possibly dumb, but I'll ask it anyway. Is there something emotional that playing guitar, playing music fulfills in your life that you don't get to like emote in your family, or you don't get to emote in your life normally? So the guitar is able to. That's why I say this is so reductive. It's so like.
Well, I mean, I have to say yes, but I don't know if it's because I couldn't express myself emotionally in words. It's because I am drawn to music that makes me feel emotions, and I am interested in what those reactions are and why they happen, but I can't always explain them. But there's no doubt in my mind that I've tried to emulate certain aspects of that and manifest them in my own work. So, for example, listening to the music of Maurice Ravel is extremely inspiring to me, and orchestration is amazing, but harmonic information is staggeringly beautiful, and it makes me feel all kinds of things. Just like there's the opening, like 2 or 3 minutes of the Duruflé Requiem. It's just something I'm obsessed with, and I want to know, why does this make my whole body tingle and make me just completely go into this amazing place? Similarly, with music that's extremely intense at times, I became obsessed with, in the 80s, with Sonic Youth and with their use of guitars and sound. And that became very influential on me. And I wanted to be able to use some of those sounds and those techniques, if you will, in my own music. So I just imitated, in a way, aspects of that work, just like I imitated aspects of John Abercrombie or Ralph Towner or John Schofield or George Benson in my work, or John McLaughlin, without having almost any of their technique or knowledge, But I just felt so inspired to hear these chords, or this one riff, or I love a good riff, I mean, who doesn't? But so I have so many songs that end with just a repeating sort of hypnotic thing where I'm trying to basically, for myself and maybe for, humanity, go somewhere else and and take us to this place that might make us all feel pretty exhilarated, if not kind of stunned into a good space by pure sound.
Yeah, so it seems like you lived your life, you kind of have like your antenna up all the time, and you're just kind of like soaking in these different things and then processing them. You're like a lens where these things.
it became even more extreme working in the record store. So I started working at Rhino Records in late 1976. And this was the beginning of the massively kind of overwhelmingly vital punk rock scene, which I had no interest in initially, but eventually it snagged me and reinvigorated my interest in rock and roll, honestly. But also, this is where I worked with this guy who put on Five Leaves Left by Nick Drake. I'd never heard of Nick Drake. And so this record came on and I just thought, oh my God, this is so beautiful. Who is this guy? And he wasn't even alive anymore at that point. I'm just like, wow, it's like, how did I miss this? How did I miss John Coltrane? He was already dead. And so I'm working around people who have all kinds of interests, not necessarily like mine, but also have access to a massive amount of music to listen to. And back then, in the, I guess, late 70s, I have to say, very important was the radio station, which at that time was really tiny and nothing like it is now, even in terms of content, KCRW out of Santa Monica College, which had, at that time, jazz music, a different DJ every night. So each DJ had a kind of a certain kind of taste or realm of expertise or interest. But it was jazz music from 8 p.m. to 8 a.m. And at 8 a.m. was this show with a DJ named Isabel Holt called Morning Becomes Eclectic. Mm-hmm. And now it's a very famous, almost cliche kind of thing. But she created the show, has had no recognition for it. And I couldn't wait to tune into her show every morning as much as I could to hear how she was going to connect all this disparate music, seemingly disparate music, which she did with this amazing kind of insight. And there was nothing like it. So, and that she would play, John Cale and Richard Thompson, and at the same time play like maybe, John Renbourn and then King Sunny Ade or something. You know what I mean? This made sense to me, and I found it inspiring. And so there was a lot of stuff to listen to, is what I'm saying. So it was just giving me more and more. And so, yeah, the antennae are up, and I'm just absorbing so much music. And I think it's still confusing to a certain extent if I try to make some kind of logical map out of it, but I wasn't worried about any of that.
Yeah. I mean, it also seems that like you don't come off like a judgmental person. You come off as kind. And I think maybe that also. In my 20s, I could be so judgmental, and I still have, everyone has opinions, and we have what we call taste. I've felt embarrassed, if not completely mortified, by times in my life where I've tossed out some sort of, I guess, dismissive or over-opinionated sentence or 300 or 400, and then later wish I could just retract it because I didn't know what the hell I was talking about, or I just wasn't sensitive to a mode of expression or a style that I knew nothing about. But at age 25 or whatever, I can tell you that I was extremely opinionated because I was focusing on what I liked, and I was dismissing the stuff that didn't have much to do with me. And I think that's something a lot of people that age do, whether it's music or literature or TV shows or clothes or whatever it is. It's just kind of part of growing up, right? Yeah. One last question. I meant to ask this earlier, but I'm kind of curious. The decision you made to leave college, was it belabored, tortured? Was it very easy to decide, like, I'm done with this, I want to focus on music?
Oh, it was really easy, even though I knew that my parents would be very unhappy. And in fact, my professor Neblet, he wasn't pleased. He wanted me around, to go through the philosophy program and do whatever I was going to do, because he liked me and I liked him, and he was really brilliant. I think the hardest thing was knowing that I wasn't really going to be able to get a degree doing what I wanted, which I could easily do now. Things have changed dramatically in this regard. So having left philosophy, I really felt good about it because I felt really bad that my parents were spending so much money to send me to this expensive college. So I felt like, well, I'm saving them money, but going to Santa Monica College, which is where people who couldn't get into fancy colleges went, and which used to be kind of the object of ridicule, was a last minute decision based on the idea that I had to start over. And I'm glad I did this because I had this teacher, Rule Beasley, who changed my life. He's still alive. He's the father of John Beasley, the jazz pianist. He's very, very important figure in Los Angeles these days. And so what made me unhappy then was knowing that I couldn't get a degree there. I had to take all the classes I wanted, which I took everything but counterpoint, which was never offered at a time that I could take it. And then I had to move on. So where was I going to move on to? Berklee College of Music again? There was almost nowhere to go still, because it was still the 70s. And so I just went to work, and I just decided that I wasn't going to get a degree because there was no place right for people like me yet, except Boston, where I didn't want to go. And so I didn't, I think it was harder on my folks than it was on me, but I would have been happy to maybe be a composition major. But then my friend Eric Von Essen, who was a composition major at UCLA, talked me out of it. And he said, why? So you can learn how to write a Baroque, string quartet, or so you can write in the style of Schumann, or so you can learn how to write a serial composition in the style of Schoenberg. Why? You're already composing. That's what he said to me. He also didn't encourage me to take guitar lessons. I'd had one really, really awful teacher, very, very briefly, thankfully, in high school, and then another one even shorter after that. They both moved away. I didn't quit. But the first one really had no business teaching guitar and really messed me up psychologically. I was trying to learn how to read music, and I was trying to learn jazz harmony on the guitar, and he had no idea how to teach this. So I just was convinced I was never going to understand music until I had Rule Beasley as a theory teacher and met Eric Von Essen, the multi-instrumentalist genius. And that's when it all sort of started coming together, maybe when I was around 20, 21 years old. It started to make more sense, and I started to feel like, oh, okay, maybe I can do this,
That actually seems like a nice place to end. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you.
And we'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye, oh, 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 bye. Bye, bye, beginnings.